Ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
Viva Puerto Rico Libre, viva Borinquen Libre, viva América Latina, nuestra América. Long live Boricua resistance to Yankee imperialism, to capitalism, to neo-colonialism. Some beautiful music from one of my favorite bands, the Ghetto Brothers. As a native New Yorker, one of the groups that I love listening to from the revolutionary era of New York, Boricua, Black Panther, Young Lords organizing amazing music. What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 55, Unmasking Imperialism, Exposing Imperialist Propaganda in Mainstream Media. Today, Viva Puerto Rico Libre, long live free Puerto Rico, Borican. We're going to expose mainstream media coverage of bankruptcy and economic turmoil in Puerto Rico. There was recently a bankruptcy deal that was reached related to Borican, to Puerto Rico. We're going to talk about how the imperialists are making it seem like they had no role whatsoever in creating this mess that exists in Borican today, and what conditions are like for Boricuas in the diaspora around the world on the island, the archipelago of Borican, of Puerto Rico, the impact of U.S. capitalism, imperialism, and neo-colonialism as one of the last U.S. colonies of Latin America and the Caribbean, of Nuestra America. And today we're going to speak with comrades who are very active and involved in the national liberation movement of Borican, of the Puerto Rican people. Joining me today, first and foremost, my homie, my comrade. I have this comrade on all the time, Comrade Libre, Afro-Boricua poet, organizer, and communist based out of Miami, Florida, whose organizing involves moving theory into practice. As a member of the Troika Kollective, they organize in their communities, and as an internationalist, they build with movements in the global South and across Turtle Island. Last time I had Comrade Libre on, we spoke about the recent trip to Nicaragua Sandinista. Now we're talking about Borican and the importance of supporting Borican national self-determination against empire. How's it going, Comrade Libre?
All is well, comrade. Give thanks. I was glad to be in Nicaragua and be on that talk. And I know we talked earlier when this article actually first dropped, and I was like, "Yo, Ramiro, we got to talk about this," and he was already on it. So I definitely appreciate that. Also, want to give a shout out to Palestine. They're being displaced. The Salih family just got their house destroyed, and Palestine is facing a lot of repression right now. So we also stand in solidarity with our comrades in Palestine.
Most definitely, Comrade Libre. The parallels between Palestine and Puerto Rico are like none other. There's so many connections. The connection between Zionism and imperialism, the way the U.S. treats Boricuas, the way the Zionist Israelis treat Palestinians. There's so many parallels there, and they're interconnected. And even historically, within the revolutionary movements, the connections between the PLO, the Young Lords, and all of these movements for Puerto Rican independence, the Macheteros. So I think they're like twin movements, twin struggles against the empire. Also joining me is compañera Monisha Ríos. Monisha is a Puerto Rican psychologist, social worker, and anti-imperialist veteran of the U.S. Army. Since 2013, she has been investigating the American Psychological Association's 104-year role in the weaponization and militarization of psychology in service to imperialism. Very fascinating, very interesting. I love talking about that, the psychology of imperialism. Monisha works to expose the psychological warfare component of U.S.-led hybrid warfare with a special focus on the narratives used to destabilize people's movements toward liberation from capitalist imperialist oppression in Latin America and the Caribbean. How's it going, compañera Monisha?
Thank you. I'm really, really, really happy to be here, and I'm eager for this conversation. So that's all I'm going to say. Let's do it.
Most definitely. And compañera Monisha is somebody that has a really interesting story because, you mentioned like part of the U.S. Army, but then rematriated back to Borican, rediscovering your roots, reconnecting with your people. And it's a process that many people in the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora hope to do as well. I hope to do that as well myself one day, to return to Honduras, where my family's from, and to be part of the movements and struggles going on there. So I could imagine it must be a very beautiful feeling to be back in your motherland. Also joining us is compañero Jorky. Jorky Badillo is an organizer and community leader coming out of the Bronx, Boogie Down Bronx. Shout out to the Bronx, with roots in mobilizing against mass incarceration and the school-to-prison pipeline in New York City. Jorky moved to Puerto Rico and is now working with the agriculture of Borican to further uplift food sovereignty and collective action on the island. Jorky is also the Minister of Education for the New Era Young Lords Party. How's it going, Jorky?
We're super grateful to be having this conversation. Excited for what's to come out of today.
Most definitely. And compañero Jorky, I think you're in Puerto Rico right now, right? You're in Puerto Rican right now?
Yes, correct.
Cool. Beautiful. So we have several comrades there right now. And also joining us, last but not least, is Comrade Sincere. Sincere is a 31-year-old Boricua who moved to Puerto Rico from Rhode Island 2 months ago. Sincere is also chairman of the Puerto Rico chapter of the New Era Young Lords Party. I actually have family in Rhode Island and Pawtucket. And Pawtucket and Rhode Island, Providence, is a really interesting area. There's a lot of revolutionary history, though, that I think people aren't aware of. There's a lot of Puerto Rican national liberation organizing that has taken place there. A really strong working class Puerto Rican community. How's it going, Comrade Sincere?
It's going great, and I appreciate you having me and Jorky on the show. I must say that in that Young Lord's introduction was beautiful. I loved it. I really enjoyed it a lot. But yeah, I'm from Providence, very familiar with Pawtucket. I lived 1 year in Pawtucket, so Pawtucket is an interesting place. It's also a city that has a history of having mills and during that whole textile movement and everything out there. That was very big out there. So when you go out to Pawtucket, you see all the abandoned mills and all the history behind everything that went down years prior. So, but yeah, everything is amazing. Thank you for having me.
Most definitely. I want to give a shout out to everybody who's watching and listening. Shout out to Comrade Yamir, to Big Teal, to Danny, to Brewski, to Comrade Erica, to everybody who's watching and listening. If y'all have a question or comment, feel free to throw it in the chat so we can ask our comrades, our panelists, and talk about the importance of supporting Boricua national liberation against empire recently, especially now with a lot of the economic turmoil and destruction. One of the things that really pisses me off about Puerto Rico and U.S. imperialism is the fact that historically Puerto Rico, the Boricua people have been the training ground, the laboratory of U.S. imperialism, going back to the Treaty of Spain to 1898, to the Spanish-American War. All of the experiments and horrible things about U.S. imperialism, the financial aspects of it, the economic strangleholds, the embargoes, the blockades, the medical experiments, the paramilitary training, the CIA subversion tactics, everything that has been exported around the world was tried and tested in Borican first since the 1800s. And it's something that doesn't get a lot of attention. People forget that Puerto Rico, Borican, is still a colony of U.S. imperialism. And even today, with all of the problems after Hurricane Maria, the debt that was imposed on the Puerto Rican people by the U.S. imperialists, and now these crypto millionaires going there, treating it like a tax haven, kicking people out, the gentrification, they place all the blame on the Puerto Rican people themselves and not on the capitalist imperialist system. So that's what we're hoping to do today, to just give that systemic perspective, because recently in the news, we've seen this deal that came out, and I'm going to play a clip in a second with some more news about that for us to react to it. But there's all this news about, this U.S. federal judge is saving Puerto Rico from its problems. And I think I'm curious to, once we speak about this later on with Monisha in particular, the psychology behind that of imperialism, of how whenever a global South nation and oppressed colonized peoples have a problem, all of a sudden it's because of their choices, right? And that's what capitalism does. It isolates the material conditions, and you chose that. Only you determine, your choice determines your outcome. And as Marxists, as materialists, as revolutionaries, we can say that material conditions determine the path of certain peoples, oppressed peoples. And it's not the individual choice and spending and mismanagement of the Puerto Rican people that led to this crisis, but rather imperialism, settler colonialism that created this. So what I want to do is I want to play a clip. This is from NBC News. This is the latest on the Puerto Rico deal. Very problematic stuff from the commentator. She kind of repeats a lot of these talking points. So I want to play this and get reactions from some of the comrades related to the way it's phrased, right? Because everything's about, it's the fault of the Puerto Rican people, and the amazing U.S. is coming in to help them out.
The U.S. territory is now one step closer to emerging from that battle. A federal judge Tuesday approved a restructuring plan that would reduce the largest portion of the island's $70 billion debt. $33 billion could be cut to about $7 billion instead. Here to explain how close the territory really is to ending its bankruptcy, NBC News reporter Nicole Acevedo. Nicole, walk us through how Puerto Rico got to this point, and also what this restructuring of its debt could mean for the island.
Well, Vicky, this is a crisis that was years in the making. You're talking about decades of excessive borrowing, mismanagement from public entities in Puerto Rico. And it wasn't until 2015 that the government said, listen, guys, we reached a public debt of about $70 billion, and there's no way we can afford this. There's no way we can pay this back. And usually when that happens, any U.S. jurisdiction has access to the federal bankruptcy code. But remember that Puerto Rico, it's not a state, it's not its own country, it's a U.S. territory. And for some reason, those laws didn't include Puerto Rico. So what Congress had to do was essentially create its own law, a specific bankruptcy process for Puerto Rico under the Obama administration in 2016. And what we're seeing here is that we have a board of federal appointees basically overseeing and managing this process of restructuring the debt here in a federal court in New York. And as part of that process, the biggest portion of that $70 billion debt, which is $33 billion, was cut down. And right now, that's part of the debt that's going to be paid by Puerto Ricans with their tax dollars. They estimate that about 7 cents of every tax dollar in Puerto Rico will go to repaying that debt.
Nicole Acevedo breaking it down for us. Thank you.
Nicole Acevedo breaking down the imperialist propaganda talking points. By the way, I love how she has the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building behind her, representing perfectly the empire and their financial schemes and exploitation of people around the world. Let's start off with Comrade Libre. Your reaction to this, and this is the mainstream narrative, right? This is Puerto Rico's problem. The U.S. has nothing to do with it. It's all about, and she said, mismanagement spending. And I feel like in a way it's kind of intended to remove confidence away from the state or the potential of having an independent state and trusting the private sector or the invisible hand of the market, which a lot of libertarians love. They say the problem is government and we need more free markets. Well, guess what? The problem in Borican is the free market. The fact that all these capitalist imperialist vultures go there, there's no strong independent government to kick them out. So your reaction, Comrade Libre, to all of this?
My reaction is the picture that's being painted is, oh my God, these Boricuas, they are mismanaging everything. And oh man, they really got themselves into a really bad position without giving, I like how they said, can you give us some context, blah, blah, blah. Yo, she did not talk about how we got invaded in 1898 and how the settler colonial government, imperialist government is currently occupying our land. And to say that we're not a country, yo, fuck that. Yo, I'm here to say Borinquen is the country that's made up of a series of islands, and we are not mismanaging anything. In fact, part of the problem is that we don't have self-determination and sovereignty, and we're not able to make decisions that benefit our own country. And this is in the laws, such as the Jones Act of 1926. We're not going to get into it, but folks should look into that. But it lays the foundation from a policy level as to the fact that we don't get to make any financial decisions, any economic decisions. It is a very top-up capitalist. U.S. government makes the decisions. We just have to enforce it, which is why this is simply the next phase of neoliberal policies that is now hitting our country to paint a picture of the white savior. Oh, the U.S., the gringo government is once again saving Borinquen. And oh, how convenient this is that we are going into an election cycle and the Democrats understand that there are more Boricuas that have been forced to come to Turtle Island that are going to be able to vote. Oh, yeah, the Democratic Party has been doing so much for the Boricua people. Look at what we've done over this past year, right? Again, lies. And this is intentional, and this is a cycle. Puerto Rico, Borinquen only gets mentioned around election cycles. Let's keep this in mind. It is it's very intentional that now they want to think about Borinquen. But in 2019, when 5,000 Boricuas died, when we didn't have electricity for a whole year, they were not talking about, oh, Boricuas, oh, they really got themselves into something. They're like, nah, y'all on your own. You ain't a state. We own you. Do something about it. You owe us money. Right? And so I hate how this is being thrown by like Judge Swain, and how they're trying to paint a picture as if we're on a path to some type of financial system that is going to systematically change the conditions of working class Boricuas. Because what we're not talking about is the fact that Boricuas are being forced to leave the island. What we're not talking about is Luma and the privatization. We'll talk about some of these things further in. But the idea that that this is helping, that this is feasible, is just entirely a lie, and we know that because they're getting ready to shut down 84 schools. We've already shut down 250. We're not talking about how the debt's getting paid. They talked about that 7% on the dollar, but they're not talking about the hospitals that have been closed. They're not talking about the schools. They're not talking about the attack on public education. And so this is quite simply, like, hands down, this is not a fucking solution. It's a restructuring. Restructuring is not a cancellation. And we don't owe the US government shit. They invaded us, right? We have an obligation to fight. So I'll leave it there.
Beautifully said, Comrade Libre. Brewski said small islands have always been prime real estate for the imperialists. Exactly, right on. Just like Borican, several other islands of the Caribbean as well. Also said America treats Puerto Rico like a sick child that they begrudgingly care for and expect praise for it, all the while actively malpracticing. It's a really crazy psychological act and manipulation scheme. And Comrade Monisha, I wanted to ask you, like, what do you think, your reaction to this as well? But obviously, this is not the beginning of it, right? The psychological nature of imperialism is going into a nation, colonizing it, fucking it up, and then indebting that population to them, saying, we helped you out. I can think of gaslighting, I can think of abuse, I can think of these different terms in psychology. Your analysis and reaction to all that.
So I like that you chose this particular clip to show, and thank you for pointing out the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building in the background, because it's an excellent example of how this propaganda works. So it's the oldest narrative in the book, right? Puerto Ricans are ungovernable. They cannot govern themselves, therefore we must do it for them. They cannot be trusted to take care of themselves, therefore we must do it for them. All that condescension, all of that narcissism, all of that American exceptionalism and settler innocence. So when I look at things like that, and when we take into consideration how old this narrative is, and just like all imperialist war narrative, it has to continually be pushed. Someone in the comments mentioned that you keep repeating the lie until it becomes believable. And that's really what it is. And so what we will never, ever, ever see in US mainstream media is an actual breakdown and critical analysis of how this debt came into being, as well as how our colonial status plays into all of it, as well as what are the US interests in maintaining our dependency on the United States, as well as what are our ruling class in Puerto Rico's interests in maintaining this dynamic as well. So there's a lot to unpack, digest, and analyze, and then figure out how to use in all of this.
By the way, I love the expression that compañero Yamil put in the chat. Fuck these crypto colonizers. I'm going to steal that. I like that a lot. Crypto colonizers. And that's a big problem that's affecting Puerto Rico, El Salvador as well, with Bitcoin, and Panama, a lot of nations around the world that are being used as these tax havens, as these areas for the global 1% to hide their money, to avoid taxes, meanwhile displacing the native population. It's something that's really disgusting to see, and really important to support movements fighting against that. Maybe we can turn to compañero Jorky, your analysis of the bankruptcy deal, and also what are some of the issues facing Boricuas in the diaspora and in Puerto Rico? Because to my understanding, I think Puerto Ricans are some of the most impoverished within the Latino community as well, one of the most impoverished nations and oppressed financially. Growing up in New York, I know that one of the biggest issues, a lot of the public housing, a lot of Puerto Rican families that working class would live in the public housing because they had no access to anything else, jobs. So maybe you can talk about some of the issues that are facing the Puerto Rican people today.
Most definitely, word. Thank you for showing that clip. just picking our brains on some of these, like our reactions and our experience with dealing and moving in this imperialist capitalist state. I think the previous comrades mentioned some very valid points. And something that comes up for me very often is, we know the way that capitalism works, right? And it only succeeds if there's a working class building the empire, right? So I often feel that this debt is really held over Boricuas and Borinquen, and it's been held over us for so long. But one thing that they never talk about is how much money they've exploited or extracted out of our own people for years, for centuries. Alone in 1 year, around seven, if my number, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the numbers that I've seen out of Borinquen, out of Puerto Rico, around 7 to 8 billion gets generated, if I'm not mistaken. Yet what we receive in support, it's not even a fraction of that. So for me, what it brings up is really this this way of imperialism working, that it's sort of, it's an extreme version of what we grew up around, right? In school, it's bullying. It's like we walk into school and immediately this bully is coming to our face saying, "Hey, where's my lunch money?" And we're like, "I need lunch money. This is my lunch money. Like, what you mean?" So I I'm also grateful for everyone that's done this work in the past and how it's motivated and inspired a lot of us to be where we're at today. So I share to that, more power to that. And I feel like right now that Boricuas are realizing this, and they've been realizing this for years, right? And it's been a constant like back and forth of them trying to sedate us and seeking to kind of keep that veil over our eyes and say, "Oh, well, you're not gonna survive without us. You're not gonna be able to," and that also leads to that power over to say, "Oh, because of this debt, now we have to implement these laws and these tactics." But I'll leave it there for now and let the rest of the comrades speak. I think it's straight up bullshit, to say the least.
Most definitely. Yeah, it's something that is really insane. And when you mentioned the value that has been extracted from Puerto Rico, when we talk about the 1800s, sugar in the 1800s was in some cases considered more valuable even than gold. And where is sugar fertile? Where is it planted? Boriquen, Puerto Rico was one of the biggest sugar exporters forcefully in the 1800s. And so much of the sugar that developed the United States economy, even when we're talking about the Domino Sugar Factory and all these sugar companies, so much of that wealth was extracted from Puerto Rico in the 1800s and into the 1900s. A lot of Boricuas were forcefully kidnapped and brought upriver from San Juan after picking sugar in the sugar fields, bringing Boricuas from San Juan to New York, where a lot of the sugar companies set up shop, and they were brought to New York. And I had this conversation before with Comrade Libre. One thing that I'm really interested in as somebody who follows politics, especially revolutionary politics and history. I love maps and seeing the history of how maps and different cities rise, how they come to be. New York, my hometown in New York is a city that has had a huge Puerto Rican diaspora population. And one of the things that I found interesting in reading about the history of New York, we're looking at a map of New York, the subway map. You have right here the East River that we're looking at in the middle. And along this East River, you have some of the biggest historic Puerto Rican communities. You have the Lower East Side right here in Manhattan. You have Williamsburg right on the other side right here. Williamsburg, by the way, was home to the largest domino sugar factory plant in the country for many years. Then moving up the river, you have Upper East Side, El Barrio, another historic Puerto Rican neighborhood, Astoria, Long Island City, another historic Puerto Rican neighborhood, and then finally the South Bronx at the very end of the river. And what's interesting about that is this whole East River was basically a commercial port. This is where all of the boats that brought sugar that was stolen from Puerto Rico landed. And this is why Boricuas were forcefully settled here in these areas. And guess what's along this whole river? Project buildings, New York City housing. And actually, my friend grew up in Williamsburg around Greenpoint. There's even a project building called Borinquen Plaza that I would visit, and there's a lot of history of Puerto Ricans living there for decades since the Domino Sugar Factory. Many of them came in the early 1900s because of the sugar trade, because they were kidnapped from Puerto Rico. So there's a lot of interesting history even within the U.S. and the connections with imperialism. I'm sure, we look at Rhode Island or Connecticut or Florida, one that also has large Puerto Rican communities. There's also a lot of interconnections there. But I wanted to also ask you, Comrade Sincere, what are some of the issues facing Puerto Ricans today? Maybe you could talk about, your experience seeing Rhode Island, Puerto Ricans in Rhode Island, and also Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico.
Rhode Island's an interesting place, especially when it comes to the Puerto Rican community. And I think out there you really do see the colonized mentality. And when I say that, it's that there isn't unity out there. With a small state and with a place that's so small. I mean, I think sometimes we fall into that mentality where we're not going to make a change, we're not going to do anything unless somebody else is doing it, because we're not used to too many exciting things going on, right? But amongst the community in Rhode Island, it's I feel it's a good example of how society or the colonizers they're able to get us to think a certain way and not unite. So when you see places like New York, when you see places like bigger states, and you see them uniting, it's a form of rebellion, a form of revolution. And I feel like sometimes in Rhode Island it was very difficult because not everybody understood that. So, coming to Puerto Rico from Rhode Island, it's a whole different thing. People over here are just ready to organize and they're ready to get the ball rolling. And like going back to the clip you showed, I'm even thinking about how we're speaking about on relationships between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, and I always saw that the relationship as an abusive relationship where you have the boyfriend telling the girlfriend, "You're nothing without me. Don't leave me. You're nothing without me. You're not gonna make it without me. You need me. You need me." And that's so far from the truth, because if you look at how much Puerto Rico gives gets to the U.S. through federal payroll taxes, is what, in the millions and the billions and stuff like that. Not to mention we have a government out here that mismanages the money, they steal the money and stuff like that. So what Puerto Rico needs is, if anything, a new change in government. It's not the same political parties, because ever since Puerto Rico has been able to vote for a political party, it's always been Los PNPs or Los Populares. There never has been a different party in office. So for starters, we need something new. We need a different party, but we need a party that's for the people. But that's how you're going to do that when basically the U.S. is, they're the puppet masters. They're always controlling something. Because even if we vote in an independent party, you got to think about where they have to swear to the U.S. Constitution and all that. They always got some type of hand. You get what I'm saying? So even with the independent party, this is going to be very limited. I believe with, you know what I'm saying? So actual change, it got to be. A little bit. Hello?
Oh, there you go. Sorry, guys. I was on mute. To add to that, I think one of the things in terms of the analogy of the abusive relationship, I think it's spot on. And I think to add to that, one thing that is fascinating is that it's also a forced relationship. It's not even like it's a relationship that the Boricua people, Borican, willfully engaged in. They were colonized, straight up colonized after the Spanish left, after the Treaty of Paris, after the Spanish-American War in 1898. The U.S. swooped in, the U.S. colonized Puerto Rico, began this exploitative, parasitic relationship, and continues to do some horrible atrocities to the Boricua people. And I think that that analogy is spot on, because then whenever Puerto Rico has problems, whenever there's issues, they always make it seem like it's the issues of the Puerto Rican people themselves. And so I think it's something that is really important to mention. What I want to do is I want to play a clip from one of the OGs of the movement, somebody who really inspires me, somebody who has had a big role in the Puerto Rican liberation movement, Oscar Lopez Rivera, somebody who has campaigned for, who's imprisoned for many years, for decades, for his revolutionary activity, talking about the importance of Puerto Rican liberation, of sovereignty, and of opposing colonization. So I'm going to play this, and I'm hoping we can talk about the long history, because Boricua, as the expression goes, right, where there is oppression, there is resistance, and the Boricua people have been resisting not even since the 1800s, since the 1500s. We can talk about the joint Taino African rebellions against the Spanish, and it's a beautiful history of resistance against colonization, past and present. So we're going to play this clip from Oscar and get your reaction and talk about the resistance of the Boricua people.
It's very, very clear that colonialism is a crime against humanity. That is according to the United Nations, and we should make sure that we say, hey, stop that, because you are perpetuating a crime. And that's a crime that should be eliminated. In 1988, the General Assembly passed a resolution 4347, alleging that all colonialism was going to be eliminated in the world during the decade of the 90s. And we are in 2020, and not a single country has been decolonized. All colonies have continued being colonies of the United States and of the world. So we have to continue struggling to end colonialism in the world. And one of our struggles right now, that pushing in Puerto Rico, is we want to take the case of Puerto Rico before the General Assembly with two primary issues. One, that in 1953, the General Assembly accepted the lie, the farce, that Puerto Ricans, because they were all of a sudden declared Estado Libre Asociado de Puerto Rico, that we had exercised our inalienable right of self-determination. And no Puerto Rican can say that. So, since 1953, the UN accepted that Puerto Rico was taken out of the list of countries that had not achieved their independence that were supposed to be, by the United Nations, supported to get their independence, and Puerto Rico was taken out of that list. And that was a farce, that was a lie, that Luis Muñoz Marin, the other side of the other government that is in Puerto Rico, because we have the annexionists, but we have somebody like Luis Muñoz Marin who started the whole thing of Estado Libre Asociado. There is no such thing. There is no free associated state. There is a colony of Puerto Rico. The Congress of the United States has absolute power over Puerto Rico. We can look into the law and we'll see that. We do not rule anything in Puerto Rico. The government of Puerto Rico is in Washington, D.C. They can tell, all we have to do is look at Ley Promesa and see why are Puerto Ricans suffering on the Ley Promesa. Because that was the creation of not of Puerto Ricans, but the creation of the Congress of the United States. So we have to be conscious and aware of what it is that we're facing. So I think that it's very important to Puerto Ricans who are in the diaspora, they can see themselves, say, we can, if we want to go with a party that is defending Puerto Rico's independence, then we can go with that person. If that person is sincere, well, we can if the person wants to vote, hey, let's vote for that party that definitely defends Puerto Rico, because the interest of Puerto Rico is not represented by the Congress of the United States. If we look at Ley Promesa, the interest of Puerto Rico is not incorporated, of the Puerto Ricans, not incorporated into Ley Promesa. If we look at every law, if we look at every structure that the United States government has instituted in Puerto Rico, every structure has been for the benefit of the metropolis, not for the benefit of Puerto Ricans. They took away from us. From 1898 now, it's been taken away from us, ripping us off, and we should not tolerate that.
Amazing words by Oscar Lopez Rivera, the OG of the movement, one of the OGs, one of the elders, somebody who I respect a lot. I wanted to ask you, passing it to you, Comrade Libre, one thing he mentioned a lot is Ley Promesa. Can you break down exactly what that is, how that impacts the Puerto Rican people, and maybe talk about other financial schemes and economic schemes that have been used to oppress the Puerto Rican people? Another one that comes to mind is the Jones Act. Anything else that you see, the junta, all of these political and economic mechanisms that have been used to oppress the Puerto Rican people?
Oof. So first of all, shout out to the OG Oscar Lopez. I work with Comrade when I'm over there in Borinquen. Sacrificed 37 years of his life for the independence of Borinquen, right? Even talking with him, he always brings up the importance of understanding the policies and the economic financial reasons why we have not achieved independence. In terms of Promesa, this is something that when it was proposed, it did not have popularity. And this is just to give folks an example, for folks that are not familiar with the way that things work in Borinquen. And comrades on here, please correct me. I don't pretend to know everything, right? We're in learning space together. But Promesa was a push by the United States government under President Obama. In 2016, we have the founding of what we call La Junta. 6 non-elected individuals. So let me rephrase this. 6 individuals that were appointed by the U.S. government to tell us Boricuas how we have to pay back the debt that we supposedly owe the U.S. government, right? And this was supposedly in an attempt to improve the quality of life of Boricuas, and also to pay back this debt that we owe. Now, this is what was said, right? And we have to understand this was again a neoliberal push, right? To make an argument, to make a case that that Borinquen is anything more than second-class citizens, that we are anything more than colonized people. It's to paint the image, similar under the Monroe Doctrine, right? That the U.S., the good neighbor, is going to make sure that they take care of people, so that they don't get led astray by these big bad people like China, Cuba, like Venezuela. That's the direction we need to be moving in, which is why they intentionally put into place these laws like Promesa that allow us to it takes away our decision-making power. It belittles the idea that we have the capability to self-govern, and that we will be sovereign, right? Not that we have the potential to be, not that maybe it'll happen, and it's going to happen, right? We are oppressed, and we are beginning to continue to organize, right? Comrades on this call have been organizing manifestaciones in Borinquen around Promesa, but also there's something called the Act 60, right, which comes right after Act 2022, which is a tax exemption specifically for foreign investors. So in talking with Comrade Oscar Lopez, actually, folks don't know he's a dope artist. He's an amazing visual artist. He learned how to paint in prison in those 37 years he was locked up. But he was painting a picture with a quote from Pedro Albizu Campos. And the quote is, ellos quieren la jaula sin los pájaros. And I've said this on other podcasts with Ramiro, right? They want the cage without the birds. What the U.S. wants is to create the conditions that they become owners of the physical material things that make up Borinquen, but they don't want Boricuas to be there. Because if that's the case, then we have to recognize the humanity of Boricuas, and we have to recognize that most of these people that are there are exploiting and shouldn't be there, right? And that is how the laws have been put into place systematically to create the conditions where, without the U.S. having to do it themselves, right? They are beginning to push mass migrations. And if you study the history, the patterns of migrations, you see mass exoduses of Boricuas going to the U.S. I also wouldn't call it mainland because it's not part of our country, right? Borinquen is this country. We're not. The U.S. is not mainland. The U.S. is Turtle Island, and so you have a mass migration of us having to leave, forcibly leaving, because of the material conditions, like many immigrants, right? And so essentially, I'm gonna tie this into the current point. There are 6 million Boricuas that currently live outside of Borinquen, and Big Till brought this up. I brought this up in an interview with By Any Means Necessary. Right, there are 6 million Boricuas outside of the island. Not the island, outside of our country, and there are 3 million Boricuas in our country. But after natural disasters, after things like this restructuring, where their aim is to pay back the debt by taking away social services such as schools, not rebuilding hospitals, and whatnot, this leads to more Boricuas leaving to the U.S. And then the U.S. has to play nice, so they do things like this, and they're like, oh, what is it? Natalie Jaresko said, the financial crisis is coming to an end. Natalie Jaresko, for those that are not familiar, is one of the 6 U.S. government appointed individuals that tell us how we got to pay our debt back. Not Boricua, right? They don't live there. They're not subject to the lived experiences of those that have to pay this debt back, right? And this is just a slap in the face. No financial crisis is coming to an end, because what we have to realize is this is being painted as a solution, but it is not systematically any different than anything the U.S. government has historically done to the Boricua people, which means that it is intentionally exploiting the labor of working class Boricuas to get access to the land, to get access to labor, cheap labor, and to maintain a colonial relationship to the U.S. And also mentally paint the picture that we are not in any way in a position of capacity to move towards sovereignty, which is a lie, which is why we have to be talking with countries like Nicaragua. I love Nicaragua. Why? It's a small country that has its own sovereignty and has used a popular campaign movement to create a party with a political line to support working class people. And despite people thinking, oh, you can't fight for your freedom, there's a Nicaraguan saying, it's the smaller the country, the bigger the dream. And so, this is a call to Boricuas. We should be rematriating. 3 of the people on this call have gone back, right, to our country. That's beautiful. We need to do a lot more of that. But we also have a responsibility in the diaspora to fight back against these lies and not be like, oh, thank God the U.S. is helping us. They ain't helping us. They don't give a shit about us, right? They want us to die, or they want us to move to the U.S., and they just want to take the things that are ours and make us think that we got to thank them for that shit. And so, you know, this makes me like super, obviously, like passionate about it, but we have to get rid of this mental what is it, slavery, that we're not at capacity to govern ourselves. And the sacrifices of people like Oscar Lopez and the macheteros is homage. Like, we have a duty to these people that have already sacrificed decades of their life, and other people like Pedro Albizu Campos, like Blanca Canales, all these amazing people that have already made sacrifices to move us towards independence, right? To maintain that narrative, and to also reaffirm in our people that there's not one point in history since 1493 that Boricuas have not fought back against oppressors and colonizers. We have always fought. So don't let nobody tell you we docile. Oh, you know, we don't know how to do. No, we've been fighting. We just need to have the conversations and create the space so we can empower our own people to continue to push. And like Conrad said, yo, we need a party with a political line that aligns with the working class people. And, you know, for me as a scientific socialist, it only makes sense, right? To move towards socialism until we can achieve communism. Yeah, I'm mute, Comrade.
Sorry about that. I totally forgot. So much facts and information. Everybody's like, oh my God, he got taken down. So much facts and amazing information in that, Comrade Libre. I really appreciate that. And just like you said, the history of Puerto Rican resistance goes back to the 1400s. The first joint Black indigenous uprising rebellion took place in Puerto Rican against Spanish colonizers, with the descendants of the Taino people and also the enslaved Africans who were brought and kidnapped to Puerto Rican, which is very beautiful to see. And even into the 1600s, the 1700s, the rebellions continued. Of course, you have the Grito de Lares, the amazing movement, revolutionary nationwide uprising for independence, for sovereignty. You have the history of the Blanca Canales, an amazing revolutionary woman, guerrilla fighter who resisted the U.S. troops, the Yankee troops. You have Lolita Lebron, Juan Pedro Albizu Campos. You have so many amazing, the beautiful Grito Lares flag right there. Some people hit me up. They're like, oh, is that the Dominican flag? I'm like, nah, it's the Grito Lares flag. So there's so much history. The Young Lords, the Macheteros, the FALN, the 2019 uprising. There's a long history of resistance, and I think that the Boricua people will continue to fight and to struggle against this. Comrade Monisha, you know, tell us a little bit about your thoughts on Promesa, its impact on the Boricua people, and also just personally, I find interesting the fact that you were a veteran of the Army. You know, what was that shift like from being in the empire and serving the empire in the Army and becoming, because I've met a lot of really amazing comrades like you who were in the Army, who were maybe in the branch of the U.S. Armed Services, and then recognizing the crimes of empire, you went the other way and turned the guns around, so to speak, in defense of your people and your class. So maybe, you know, start off with talking about the impact of Promesa, and then tell us your story, because I think that's something that's really fascinating.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about that too. So I wanted to add to what Comrade Libre was talking about around the history of Promesa. And I just learned this last night while preparing for this awesome show. So I started Googling the International Monetary Fund in Puerto Rico, because Promesa and all of the austerity measures that are impacting our people are IMF style, right? So I wanted to look at why, what's the history behind that. And I found the U.S. Senate Committee on Finance hearing on the financial and economic challenges in Puerto Rico from September 29th, 2015. So this is right before Promesa took place. And what's incredibly interesting, it's a very long document and I haven't finished reading it and analyzing it yet, but this was at the time that Pierre Luisi, who's the current governor of Puerto Rico, was the resident commissioner. So Pierre Luisi happens to make a report to this congressional committee where he's discussing the debt, discussing how it cannot be paid back. He identifies the core economic problem of Puerto Rico is the lack of growth, and that there needs to be a strategy to increase capital investment. Government reform is essential. And now I'm reading directly. Puerto Rico has an inefficient central government whose competence and credibility are questioned by prospective investors. The government has stifled rather than unleashed the private sector's potential. So this is crucial. And then he also goes on in response to one of the other U.S. Congress people who were present and who had already made some discriminatory statements about Puerto Rico. He says, finally, the governor has portrayed the debate about whether Puerto Rico will meet its obligations to creditors as us versus them. And this is the kicker. The countless men and women from Puerto Rico who own our bonds know better. So right there, he implicates all Puerto Ricans in the debt, which we know better that that's not correct. So then what's also interesting, the next person to speak was Melba Acosta, president of the Government Development Bank for Puerto Rico. So looking back into the history of IMF debt restructuring, we can look at Greece. And there's another document that I found that was really interesting. Somehow we can figure out how to share it. But it talks about how similar the situation that Greece went through is to what Puerto Rico is going through. And they called it a troika, which I'm laughing at because troika. But there were three main entities that were involved in this whole massive austerity warfare, basically, on the people of Greece through this IMF debt restructuring thing. So what's really interesting in Ms. Acosta's testimony to the committee is, reading directly, earlier this year, it became apparent that additional measures were needed, and Puerto Rico commissioned a team of economists led by Dr. Ann Kruger, former deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund, to undertake a comprehensive analysis of Puerto Rico's challenges. They identified a number of things and highlighted the need for debt relief. In light of the report's findings, our governor ordered the creation of a working group to develop a plan for economic development and fiscal institutional reform. This is key. Okay. I won't go into what the plan calls for, but it relates directly to how Promesa is being implemented currently and how this debt restructuring plan took shape. It proposes legislation to create an independent control board appointed by the governor, with jurisdiction over government entities in Puerto Rico to ensure compliance with the plan. In addition, it also calls on the federal government to act. So there's a whole lot more in this document to analyze and unpack. And I think everybody who's working on Promesa needs to do it if they haven't already. But what really stands out to me is that this is something that Pierre Lovisi and other people who were in support of this plan from the statehood camp, they supported and asked for. And then we get Promesa. And then look at Pierre Luisi's relationship to La Junta. And then look at the fact that he then became governor. All of this stuff is connected, you know? And I think if we dig a little bit deeper, this will really inform us and inform our resistance in a useful way. So there's a lot more that I could say about that and just that document alone. But something else that's key to point out is that Natalie Jaresko came from Ukraine, and where she implemented the IMF's largest debt restructuring thing in its history. And she was appointed the finance minister of Ukraine right around the crucial time that the color revolution happened and the government was overthrown. Then when she's done there, then she gets appointed to work on Puerto Rico. So I'll stop with that and then go into the other stuff about myself personally. That's a really long story, but the short version is that, like a lot of poor people in the U.S., I was born and raised in the States. unfortunately not in the homeland, because that's a result of, I'm also Viequense. So anybody who knows about Vieques knows about, for more than half a century, the U.S. bombed all war, all but real war practice took place in Vieques starting in right after World War II. And that led to a lot of flight. My father was one of the people who fled. These bombings did not stop until 2013. And that's why I was born in the US. But I didn't know our history. Growing up poor, and you know how they really target Black and brown Indigenous kids. I was recruited in school. I was 14 years old. So, a lot of this stuff that people want to talk smack about the military, like you knew what you were getting into. Most of us didn't. That's ignorant. I knew that I wanted to go to college and I wanted healthcare. I wanted to be able to help take care of my family. That was it. So while I was in, I encountered a lot of sexual violence. I got out early. I got injured, was threatened with military prison because I disobeyed an unlawful order. And the life for me after getting out was really hard. I suffered a lot with moral injury, post-traumatic stress, and all that stuff. And it took a long time for me to kind of start asking questions. And once I started asking questions, why was I treated the way that I was treated as a woman? Why, as a veteran, do women veterans still lack accurate and adequate, effective healthcare that's for our needs? Why is it that when I go to the VA for treatment, I'm still under threat of assault? I got involved in movements around that, and that's where I really saw even more what U.S. exceptionalism is, what like the white supremacist patriarchal attitude that dominates the U.S. is, because in the process of just like discovering and learning about the world around me at the same time that I'm learning about sexual violence and conflict, and I saw, wow, everywhere that U.S. military is stationed, which everyone needs to know, there are way more than 800 installations out there in the world. There are approximately 4,800 U.S. defense sites on all continents in more than 160 countries. That is the actual footprint of the U.S. military. So when you think about how many military personnel are present in nearly 4,800 defense sites around the world, how much sexual violence goes with that? Nobody wanted to have that conversation with me because we could only focus on U.S. veterans and only focus on women veterans because we're better than them. And I couldn't live with that. So that's how I just flipped, and I didn't look back. And then I started educating myself more and more. And I encountered other veterans who were anti-imperialists, who took me under their wing and started teaching me. And I started reading Marx, Lenin, Mao, everybody. And, long story short, that's how I ended up here.
I'm glad we have you on our side now. And that's an amazing, thank you so much for sharing that, compañera Monisha. That's really powerful. And I'm sorry to hear that you went through all of that in your experience within the Army. Could imagine how disgusting some of those men are in that space, and just seeing how reactionary and imperialist the nature of that institution is. And I want to read a chat from Latino Mifune. The colonizers actively deny us the knowledge of our history and the knowledge of ourselves, so we only see ourselves as their appendages and not as an autonomous and free people. Beautifully said. I think that's very spot on. And what Comrade Monisha was talking about in terms of Promesa is a perfect example of that, completely using this fake group of 6 people who nobody even knows who the fuck they are, using the IMF, that I'll call them the International Mafia Fund, to impose these economic stranglehold measures to basically exterminate a people. And as Comrade Libre mentioned as well, basically they want the cage with no birds. very similar to Palestine, by the way, which is why whenever the Zionist Israelis are like, "Oh, I love hummus and I love the," I'm like, dude, that's not yours. Like, that's Palestinian. Like, even their land, like, I'm like, nah, that's Palestinian. That's not Israeli, you know? So I'm always like, there's so many similarities there. But, moving over to comrade, compañero Jorky, you're from the Bronx, obviously a very beautiful history of organizing, of revolutionary politics there, of also large Puerto Rican community. Now you've moved back to Puerto Rico. You're involved with food sovereignty and political movements and also the New Era Young Lords. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your political journey? How did you evolve from living in the Bronx? Maybe what were some of your understandings of the Young Lords and Puerto Rican liberation movements? And how did you get involved now with the New Era Young Lords Party?
For sure, Conrad. Well, I guess I can start off with saying that in my early childhood, I moved around a lot. So I grew up partly in Newark, which, if folks know Newark, it's not that different than like some boroughs in in New York City. I'm also half Dominican, so I kind of share a crossbreed of just cultures and so much similarities, but also so much difference. So I grew up some time in La República Dominicana, or as we call it, El Patio. But I guess my journey started really when I moved to the Bronx. These were times that both of my parents, at the time that they were together, just facing financial difficulties. This was also after the Great Depression. I say that in quotes because also some of these things are really planted in our communities for certain reasons. But yeah, my parents saw themselves having to move to the Bronx. And now me being where I'm at today, looking back at it, I'm so grateful that they did. One of my first routes of traveling through the Bronx was right around the Lincoln Hospital. Come to find out years later, such revolutionary actions were held there. And also really appreciative of the culture that welcomed me. I learned about how the Bronx being like one of the main birthplaces of hip hop, and how that in itself was also a revolution, a movement in itself, right? So for me, moving to the Bronx, I would say is what really politicized me in such a way that it put me in the face, right? Like it showed me the belly of the beast, to say the least. And there I already had grown up knowing, right? Like I know something that my mom used to tell me when I was little is that like cops were targeting specifically Boricuas and Black folks that were like riding around together. So even from a really young age, 4 or 5 years old, I was learning about these tactics, right? White supremacist tactics, colorist tactics, to try to seek to divide us as a people. But my journey really started in high school. One of the first things that I worked on as a youth was the student metro cards, being at risk of getting cut off. If you're from New York and you were around there in like 2010, 2009, that was a big fight. And one of my first symbolic moments and why I believe so much in this work, the fact that so many students across all of New York City from different walks of life, all over the diaspora, the immense power that we held as a people that got us where, that got us what we needed. It was like students were like, no, we're not gonna allow, like, I'm not sure if y'all are aware of that issue specifically, but basically the city was pointing at the state and the state was pointing at the MTA, trying to figure out, who's gonna put up the funding. But yeah, we organized a student walkout, which ended up in like I want to say nearly almost in the thousands, like almost 10,000 students at the Brooklyn Bridge. From start to finish, the Brooklyn Bridge was filled with students, organizers, people, allies from all over the place. So that was really, I would say that was a really impactful moment for me, that really showed me, you know, that we as a people do have the power, and we live in a system that seeks to divide us, that seeks to essentially make us powerless, right? And I see that relating to Borinquen now, and why I'm so grateful to be here and to work on this with my comrades and my people, our people, the people, right? Is that we're also ground zero for a lot of things. Throughout history, we know that medicine, right, has been tested predominantly in indigenous Black and brown communities, Puerto Rico being one of them, specifically for women, sterilization, right, throughout the decades, and it's still going on to this day. So yeah, I just very much see a lot of connection, and I wouldn't be able to say that I'll be here where I'm at today without growing up in the Bronx. One of the organizations that I was involved with, Sisters and Brothers United, their motto was straight off of the 10-point platform of the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. You know, they sought to center the voices that were most directly impacted. They sought to occupy space. They sought to really also give the tools, put the tools in the hands of the community, right? To let the community know that there's a fire. We're not starting that fire. The fire's already there. We could choose to acknowledge it, or we could choose to ignore it. You know, so there was a lot of, and there's still a lot of beautiful, impactful work going on there. You know, I'm very much connected to my New York diaspora and folks that are organizing there. I think at the end of the day, this movement in itself is international, right? This is a international movement that we're building. Even though here today we're talking about our mainland, Borinquen, you know. I think there's so much power behind that, and we, you know, we feel that, we know that. That is a little bit of what got me to where I'm at today. My transition from working on the school to prison pipeline, which was my heaviest focus from high school up until age 24, right? And obviously the mass incarceration system of the US and imperialism in general. Transitioning from that and seeing the effects on our communities and our peoples, right? It was a really interesting transition to now being part of and wanting to involve myself in agriculture and uplift, right, the agriculture of Borinquen, but it's so directly connected, right? When they control what we eat, we can't control who gets these foods, right? We can't control how well we're nourishing ourselves. We can't, we can't, basically we're put in a position that we have to rely on foods and methods to access these foods that kind of really disconnect us from the origin, right? I firmly believe that at the root and at the core of colonialism is a desire to disconnect people from their roots and from the land, right? And just being here in Borinquen has taught me so much. I have here about 1.5 years now, but just the immense connectivity that I feel to the people and to the land here, and desiring to work with that, you know, that in itself, it's part of the colonial rule. The reason why Borinquen is importing 90% of their foods. Yet we have such abundant land. You know, I personally work with agricultores here on the island, people that work with farmers, people that work with cultivators, you know, and there's folks that are heavily holding on and, you know, and ¿cómo se dice? Fortalizando, like it's strengthening this movement, and it's beautiful. There's also a strong empire that is seeking to, like I said, disconnect us. you go to a supermarket here and all you see is imported foods from outside. So that leads to people thinking that they have to depend on these systems. You know, I very much agree with the comrade. I'm sorry if I say it wrong. Monisha, like the comrade Monisha said. You know, I feel like there is that disempowerment that we go through in these processes. And in a way, I very much seek to focus on, for, you know, apart from the movement as a whole, I seek to uplift the agriculture and seek to and learn with folks and also empower folks to know that we can build our own economies, we can build our own agriculture, and when we start doing that, we can have more control in what goes on, and we don't have to depend on La Junta, because at the end of the day, these folks are not for us, are not by us. It very much gives me the energy of a nonprofit that is putting people in the board that are not from that community, that have not been directly impacted, that do not know one bit of what's going on the island, that are so disconnected from the people. It's like these studies go on and on, but at the end of the day, who is being asked these questions? You know, when they research what is going to help Puerto Rico, what is going to help Borinquen, who are they asking? It's not us. It's not the people in the streets every day that have to wake up at 3 a.m, you know, and work literally from 3 a.m. till maybe 6 o'clock at night just to make $70-$60. They're not asking those people, you know. And when we try to step out of that colonial mindset, right, which we all are here, and I'm so grateful and honored to be in there. But I do mention that because we have a lot of our people that are still stuck in that and that way of being, you know. And for me, I see it as it's only part of the miseducation. You know, to a certain extent, at a certain point, I was also misled and miseducated. So I am here to shed that light, to also learn with my people and seek to kind of just eliminate all these things that we've been taught that seeks to keep us as, you know, in this indoctrinated mental slavery empire. Just sharing that love, because at the end of the day, our people have been misled for so long, you know, and more than anything, you know, more power to the people, y'all. Like, a revolution without the people at its center is not a revolution. You know, a revolution without celebration is not a revolution. A revolution without dancing is not a revolution. You know, so I feel like all of those things kind of encompass who we are as a people, and I'm grateful for that. So that connection is still there. I'm still very, like I said, connected to people in New York, and I seek to further build, because I know that there's also a large diaspora out there that don't know one bit about our mainlands, you know, and how connected we are as a people too, how connected our ancestors have been for hundreds of years before we came, you know, and just seeking to spread that love. And for whoever is seeking to come back to the island, to know that you have the support, you know. And it's better for us to take it over than to allow these gringos to take it over, because you know what, they're not going to create communities for us. They are doing it. They feel so entitled in their power that they can come out of their face and say that I'm a gringo Rican.
Oh my God.
You know, that is the that's the peak of invasion. That's the peak of colonialism. It's stealing somebody's culture, kicking the people out of their own land, and saying, "Oh, we have the power to buy this. We have the power to own this. So you have no right to be here right now." You know, and I grew up in the Bronx seeing this too. Like, I grew up right next to Fordham University. Fordham University is a prime example of colonialism, even in the Bronx, because it's a gated community. You know, it's a very much, it works as a lottery in many cases. They raffle natives, Bronx native, right? And then I'm not gonna take away from the folks that actually, you know, do what they what they have done to get into the school, but that in itself, it's a form of, you know, keeping a certain people at in a certain secure space. And if you look at a lot of the communities out here that where the gringos feel most comfortable, where these invaders are feeling most comfortable, are the condominiums, are the gated communities, because they know damn well what they're doing is not right.
Yeah. Wow. So much. Thank you so much, compañero Jorky. So much beautiful knowledge and personal insight. As a New York native myself, I know exactly the walkout you're talking about and the connection between the student metro cars and the school to prison pipeline. Because the first time I actually got stopped by the police was hopping the turnstile because I ran out. You know those little old green metro cards that we used to have? You know, you will get like 3 rides a day as a student, and I ran out of my last ride because I was going to soccer practice, and I hopped the turnstile. So me and my friend, we hopped it. The cops chased after us. So that could have been the beginning of my delineation into the school to prison pipeline, the neoliberal crackdowns, austerity, and it's all connected to Puerto Rico, to the Bronx, the comparison of colonization in the Bronx with Fordham, prestigious quote unquote university in El Barrio, you know, and also the colonization in Puerto Rico and the Bitcoin, the crypto colonizers, as Comrade Yamir was mentioning, is uncanny. So I really appreciate that comparison. Before I pass it over to Comrade Compañero Sincere, I want to read. This is the 13-point program and platform of the Young Lords Party. We want self-determination for Puerto Ricans, liberation of the island and inside the United States. We want self-determination for all Latinos. We want liberation of all third world people. We are revolutionary nationalists and oppose racism. We want equality for women, down with machismo and male chauvinism. We want community control of our institutions and land. We want a true education of our Creole culture and Spanish language. We oppose capitalists and alliance with traitors. We oppose the American military. We want freedom for all political prisoners. We are internationalists. We believe armed self-defense and armed struggle are the only means to liberation. And last but not least, number 13, we want a socialist society. A very beautiful platform, one of my favorite platforms of the Young Lords Party, which I think their demands were so beautiful. And this is also, by the way, one of my favorite artworks, poster. Young Lords Party has the AK and it says health, and then the magazine clip of the AK, struggle, food, struggle, housing, struggle, education, struggle. And these are all connections that are all used, you know, that are relevant to all over the diaspora in Puerto Rico, in the Bronx, in all these areas. Comrade Sincere, you know, your transition, you're also you know, from from Puerto Rico, but you lived in the US, Rhode Island, and now you moved to Puerto Rico. Tell us about your political journey, why and when you decided to move, and also talk to us about the influence of the Young Lords Party and the New Era Young Lords Party.
Most definitely, and I'm hoping I don't get cut off again. I don't know what happened earlier, but I guess
it's all good.
It's
la CIA.
So I would say, man, I would consider myself becoming more and more, I guess, revolutionary in my teenage years, because that's kind of like when you start being a little more rebellious against authority and things like that. So I felt like I had that energy, but I would use it towards in high school. We had a principal who wasn't from the community, because in Providence it's like the school system is so messed up, and like they a lot of teachers don't want to teach in the Providence school system because it's an inner city, you know what I'm trying to say? And a lot of those teachers, they just don't want to take the time out to understand students. So it's a tough, you know, community. But I mean, with just understanding the people there, you could get by. You know what I mean? So they would just basically hire anybody because they'll pay more money to get these teachers, these principals in there. That, like I said, they don't even understand the community of the kids. So I remember we had this principal who was, you know, definitely, you know, she was definitely on that racist tip, you know what I mean? To the point that she couldn't even control the school, so she would always use the police force to basically try to get people in line. And I just always saw that, and I just would always see how, you know what I'm saying, people rightfully would get upset, but they would just cuss her out. But me, my whole thing was like, nah, this ain't it. I'm going to use my smarts against her. So I would just always catch her and stuff and make her feel stupid. And it'll be on some like on some time where it's like the teacher will even be like, yo, like he caught her. Like, you know what I'm saying? She wasn't ready for that. She just wanted somebody to bug out on her, this and that. I mean, she would still try to get the cops involved. Don't get me wrong, but it was just like, I bet. Well, I'll go to your office. I'll just take the side door and just head home. You know what I mean? Because I didn't have time for that. Because she didn't even know me by name, but she knew I was like the pain in the ass that she couldn't stand. But I think that was my beginning of like really becoming revolutionary in my own sense. I kind of wanted to go against the authority, and I felt like we were being oppressed in school. So I think like during that time, I also, I started learning more about the young lords, learning more about my history. And it was interesting because I was Puerto Rican and everything. And I found that to be cool, but I was proud, but I wasn't like, how can I say it? It was like, it didn't become deeper than that. Like, I'm proud to be Puerto Rican. It didn't turn into that until I started really learning about my history, right? Because a lot of my family members, they're all populares. That's their belief. So I'm really the one that became for independence. I came out different, but that's because I did my studying. And once I learned my history and I was teaching my family, it's like, all right, they respected the belief, but I just became really empowered when I learned about Pedro Aviso Campos, when I learned about the macheteros, when I learned about Blanca Canales and all those incredible people. And then from there, it's just like, as you start really growing and growing, it starts getting to that point where you're like, I started feeling like this is my path. Like, I'll die for my country. You got what I'm saying? Like I won't fight. I won't go to war for the U.S., but I'll go to war for my people and for PR. I think it just got to that point, right, where I was sick and tired of just watching Facebook videos and live streams of the protests out here and sharing these posts. It was like, well, I have no kids. I'm single. I really felt like making that move out here. You know what I'm trying to say? And then it was like a 2-year battle, because I'm not gonna lie. It's like when you're comfortable in a place, like, oh man, but I have to, have to do this and that, and to really just move to PR, it's somewhat risky. You know what I'm saying? Because you're like, this could go wrong, but then it's like, but it could go right. What do I have? You know what I'm trying to say? So I think for 2 years I was battling that. I was just like, damn, I want to move, but like, I don't know. And I ended up coming across Subi. Subi is the national chairman of the New Era Young Lords. And I decided to get down with the Connecticut chapter first, and there I was trained. And for the record, a lot of people don't know this. We're not just staying with young lords and things like that. Like Tata Jimenez himself, gave that blessing. We have originals that work with us. We have Omar Lopez that he's on our committee, and David Rivera, who they were 2 of the first 7 young lords, and Chata's right hand men, and they're on our committee and everything. So we do work with originals. Out here in Puerto Rico, we work with Panama. Panama was one of the original young lords from the New York chapter. He also helped with taking over the Statue of Liberty and putting the Puerto Rico flag across the forehead of the Statue of Liberty. So, he works with us very closely, very closely. He's like a coach, you know what I'm saying? I last time I was speaking to him, I jokingly said to him, he's like Phil Jackson, like he's just, he's that coach, you know what I'm saying? He's royalty, he got all those rings and everything, and he's just like coaching the team, basically. But yeah, I got down with the Connecticut chapter. I was the co-minister of defense for Connecticut for a little bit, and they actually wanted me to create a chapter in Rhode Island. And I kind of know how Rhode Island, yeah, that's the picture right there. That's what I was referring to. Rhode Island is such a difficult place, but they wanted me to go out there and become the chairman and start a chapter out there. So I went ahead and did that. As chairman, I you know, collaborating with a lot of organizations out there. I got involved with the police brutality, you know, with the police brutality situations out there, securing people that were getting death threats from white supremacists. You know, I was there getting busy. You know what I mean? It was a small chapter, but you know, I did what I needed to do. And then, like I said, I came out here to Puerto Rico in August. When I was out here, I really felt like I needed to be out here. You know, it was just bothering me to the point that when I went back to Rhode Island, I was just so underwhelmed. It's like, I can't be here anymore. I need to get out of here. Like, this just ain't it. What am I doing here? And, you know, you start getting tired too, because it's like, you know, you have all these colonizers coming out here, all these Yankees, all these gringos coming over and thinking they're going to run stuff. And, you know, it just hit me even more that I was like, damn, my grandparents had to move out of PR. My parents went along, and it's like, nah, I'm going back to my roots. I'm going to go back to my people. Like, this is, I belong in PR. I don't belong in Rhode Island. I don't even belong in the U.S. You know what I'm saying? Like, I just feel like being in the U.S., they take so much from you, even from your culture. It's like, nah, like, I'm going back to where my people are at, to my roots. And that, you know, the health, I went ahead and took that leap, and everything it's been smooth. Everything been great. Like, it's just meant to happen. You know, I decided that I wanted to create a chapter out here. It was a little difficult because if you look into the history of the Young Lords, when they tried to start a chapter originally in the 70s in Puerto Rico, it didn't work out well. And I know, you know, a lot of people were concerned about that, especially the originals. Especially the originals, they were just like, damn, like, this is something big, because when we try to do it, stuff didn't work out. So they just really wanted me to go out there, and they really wanted me to make it a little.
I think you cut off a little bit, Comrade Sincere. Let me see if we can hear you. Can you hear us okay? Okay, I think your connection exactly related to what we're talking about, right? The interconnectivity, the infrastructure of Borican. They're putting the island, the archipelago, into so much debt, and not even being able to provide infrastructure and good data for our comrades to connect. Can you hear us okay, Sincere? Huh. Okay, we can't hear you, and you're not muted. So it might be your connection, but you know what, comrades? We're definitely gonna have to do another version of this because y'all are so amazing. I think unfortunately the internet connection is kind of crappy, so we'll have to continue this again. But there's so much that we haven't even talked about that I want to get to. That you guys are so amazing. And by the way, that story that Comrade Sincere was talking about with being the rebellious kid in the classroom, it's so interesting because this is a political cartoon. You know, this is something that goes way back. This is a political cartoon called School Begins, and it's a political cartoon from the Spanish American War, where it has Uncle Sam, the rising imperialist figure, in a classroom, being that racist teacher with all these black and brown students who are portrayed in a very horrible way. And lo and behold, in the front row, you have Puerto Rico, or they spell it Puerto Rico, um, as being among the rebellious students that have to be isolated. And I just found so many parallels because the microcosm, you know, your example being the rebellious kid speaking out against this racist teacher in the classroom, it's also exemplified by Puerto Rico and the U.S. empire in general, and the rebellious nature of our global South people. So I found that to be a really beautiful analogy. And also what I found really amazing too, in Marxism, we have this concept called the negation of the negation. It's one of the three laws of the dialectic. It's that everything returns back to source. You can leave somewhere, but then you come back to that land with a revived new viewpoint and knowledge. And it's like, it's kind of what happened with your family. Like your grandparents left, your parents left, your family lineage has come back, but now with a new ideological view of like Puerto Rican liberation, of revolutionary politics, returning back to source on a newer and higher level. And I think it's something that is really beautiful. And I think with rematriation, it's something that is very fascinating. Just to close off, because compañera Monisha wanted to address this, and it's been really dope having you comrades on. There was one brother earlier on in the chat who basically said something along the lines of like that the Puerto Rican, hold on, let me just pull it up here before. Here we go. I support Puerto Rican independence, but sadly, the Puerto Rican people don't want it. So, Comrade Monisha, your reaction to that?
Thank you. So I'm not going to dog Mario because a little bit later on, you know, when folks were discussing this in the comments, he mentioned, I'm sorry, I don't know your pronouns. Mario mentioned the referendum. And so I want to talk about psychological warfare in relation to the referendum, right? What does colonial psychological warfare look like in the context of Puerto Rican status? And, but first, could you let me know how much time we have left? Because I want to be conscious. 5 minutes? Okay. Okay, thanks. So I'm going to set my timer for like 3. All right. So what you all are getting in the US around that referendum is complete propaganda. Anybody who's not Puerto Rican and anybody who's not Puerto Rican and not involved in politics in the homeland is not going to know any better, right? So we can't get mad and angry and blame people for reacting to the information that they're receiving because this is all by design. So what we need to really hone in on with this is that the results of that referendum, we know is bad data. We know that that's a lie. We know that there was barely any participation in the status referendum to begin with. And so this 51, 52% mandate that people are throwing around in US media and that the statehood faction is using to its advantage in Congress and in international arenas as well is false. A lot of people don't know the strength of the boycott, the electoral boycott that occurs in Puerto Rico around this question of status. And that has its drawbacks as well. And that's kind of what we're seeing. So like in my introduction, like my expertise is in analyzing the psychological warfare and these narratives that are being used, right? So to the Comrade Mario and anybody else who has questions around how this referendum is being used, how it's being weaponized to undermine the Puerto Rican independence movement, to undermine an actual self-determination process for Puerto Rico, which cannot happen as long as U.S. interventionism is taking place, and that's all that's happening. I'm going to start offering classes actually for people who want to really get into this, because I think it's a missing piece of our like collective political ed that needs to be there. Okay, I'm going to get on arranging that. But in my last minute, I want to talk about how important it is when we're discussing status and when we're discussing our strategies and tactics around dealing with our struggle for independence and liberation. There's a tendency of romanticizing and having an over-attachment to a particular set of tactics. And there's a lack of analysis, and this is also by design. So this is not me dogging anybody, but there's it's an observable lack of analysis around all the different types of warfare that are taking place and all of the different tactics and techniques we can use, including voting in status referendums as a tactic of our own psychological operations to counter the exact narrative that Mario was referencing. Right. So I'll leave it with that. I have 4 seconds left, but thank you for the time to address that.
It just, when you said you have 4 seconds left, it reminded me of Squid Games where they have that clock and you're like, oh, you got to win this game. But I was like, nah, we're not like that. We're not that grimy. But comrades, it's been a real pleasure. I would love to have y'all on again soon. We didn't even get to like a quarter. I had so many notes about like the macheteros and the FALN and Filiberto, and there's so much to cover when it comes to Borican and Puerto Rico. So I'd love to have y'all on. Y'all are so amazing. By the way, y'all look so like being back in Borican, no offense, Comrade Libre, you also are glowing, but the comrades who are in Borican are like glowing. There's like an inner peace that y'all have just being back in your motherland, and I could tell just being there, the energy y'all have, you're just like at peace. I don't know how else to explain it. But you know, me and Comrade Libre, we're in the belly of the beast still. We're fighting the empire from desde las entrañas del monstruo, and part of the struggle, international struggle. So we'll keep doing that. But thank you, comrades, so much for being on. And I think we're just going to wrap up with one last comment from Comrade Libre.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to make this so quick. First of all, thank y'all for coming in and being in a learning space. The duty of internationalism is to help support revolution and sovereignty wherever people are fighting for it. And Borinquen is a place where that is the case. Speaking of the macheteros, Filiberto Ojeda said, right, and rightfully so, there is a necessity for militancy because the U.S. invaded us, and any country that gets invaded has the right to protect its country by any means necessary. You're not going to tell me how to protect my country from somebody that is invading me, right? In the same way that the Palestinians have a right to figure out how they want to fight, Haitians as well. We're not going to tell people how to fight their fights. As long as they get towards liberation, that's the important thing. And for folks to get educated, a lot of us don't get this education, so we had to seek it. Comrades talked about that, right? Food sovereignty, check out Friends of the ATC in Nicaragua, because that's a country that was able to maintain their independence because they have food sovereignty, something that Borinquen can look to as an example. And in terms of movements and militant movements, there are books. I recommend one, Revolution Around the Corner, Voices of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party in the U.S., edited by Jose E. Velasquez. So we just have to create more of these spaces, and we have to educate ourselves and seek out this knowledge. So thank y'all for hopping on. Tomorrow on Troika's Instagram, we're going to be with some of these same comrades talking about a similar topic, and probably dive into some different aspects of Borinquen. So check us out at Troika Kollective. And I want to finish by saying we wholeheartedly support the Partido Libre. Honduras is being attacked by the oligarchy. It's being attacked by neoliberal factions, including the U.S. government. And we support our comrades. We actually have a comrade that's going there to cover it. So y'all, all eyes on Honduras. We support Xiomara Castro and the Partido Libre, and we have to ensure that that country is able to maintain their sovereignty. So all power to the people, all power to oppressed people. Thank you.
Beautifully said, Comrade Libre. Right on. Solidarity with the Partido Libre in Honduras. And as a longtime supporter of Libre, was involved in organizing Libre in the diaspora. So right now, the gringos, imperialists, are trying to destabilize the situation there. Viva Puerto Rico Libre, Viva America Latina Libre, Viva Nuestra America. Long live Marxism, Leninism, long live international communism, the proletarian movement. And we're going to go out with some amazing revolutionary Boricua music. Shout out to my comrade Yamir, who actually shared this in one of the chats. This is a song called Oldest Colonia by Siete Nueva. It's a bop. I was listening to it this morning. I was like, damn, this is some really dope music. So we're going to go out to that. Peace out, comrades. I would love to have y'all on. Viva Puerto Rico Libre. Take care, everybody. Peace out.
Las colonias más viejas florecen cual flamboyán y se enrojecen como el agua de volcán. Españoles ni gringos pueden con ella porque es nuestra y venimos a defenderla. Yo salí del lobo del huracán.
Esta es la crema del Caribe, el roble y el Guayacán. Así se vive en el ojo del huracán. Uva de playa, montañas, mujeres bellas. Esta es la isla donde nacen las estrellas.
Una lluvia de adoquines para emprender el camino. Cruzamos en esta ruta que por siglos construimos. Una avalancha de gente que despierta a los vecinos para abrir la nueva ruta que le depara el destino. Como si un golpe de agua se disfrazara de fuego. Como un río de esperanza para abonar dicho suelo. Lucecitas de motoras unidas como un cometa, inundando la ciudad porque el pueblo se respeta. Una rita muestras de más ganas y de gases para el llanto, amenizando la fiesta que estábamos preparando. Un carnaval de adoquines que le llueve en sus cabezas al medirse en nuestro pueblo y probar su fortaleza contra el más omnipotente, el más irreversible, el poder que tiene el pueblo cuando se atreve a ser libre. No lo para la sombrilla, ni la lluvia, ni la bala. Una muestra de poder vale más que mil palabras, vale más que las promesas, que el confeti y los cupones. Frases revolucionarias de una bola de melones. Gloria a los encapuchados, gloria a los motociclistas, gloria a las manos que rompen adoquines y los tiran. Si de manera ilegal nos pretenden someter a un estado de derecho que no se puede aguantar, ni sostener base constitucional sobre la cual defender ante un foro internacional. La impunidad con que su corte imperial se ha repartido el botín del tesoro nacional. Nuestras escuelas que pretenden convertir en un negocio vulgar para robar y robar. Llaman gobierno, democracia, qué sé yo, Estado libre asociado, dinastía Rosselló. Esta es la patria de Romero Barceló, la estrella 51 con la que se tropezó. Un instrumento de su propia destrucción, el pueblo que no conoce la historia de su nación y no lo arregla un cambio de gobernación. Batalla de eufemismos, hace falta una revolución.
Las colonias más viejas florecen cual flamboyan y se enrojecen como el agua de volcán. Españoles ni gringos pueden con ella, porque es nuestra y venimos a defenderla. Dios se linden los de luz.